and His Excellency Stefan Sesanovic will give this speech on American-Russian relations in the framework of Georgian crisis, and of course American and Russian relations with Turkey will be emphasized on. So let me a little bit give you a brief information about His Excellency. Stefan Sesanovic is the George Kennan Senior Fellow for Russian and Eurasian Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations, and the Catherine Ann Shelby Colum Davis Professor of International Diplomacy at Columbia University. His particular areas of expertise are Russia and the former Soviet Union, Caucasia and Central Asia, and American foreign policy. From 1997 to 2001, he served as Ambassador at Large and Special Advisor to the Secretary of State for the new independent states. In this capacity, he was the State Department's principal officer responsible for policy toward the states of the former Soviet Union. His Excellency received his PhD from Harvard University and his BA from Cornell University. He is co-author or editor of several volumes on international affairs and has contributed articles to the National Interest, Foreign Affairs, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and other publications. In addition, he is a member of the advisory board of the National Interest. Now, I think there are numerous international relations students here, and they are very much interested on the subject. I hope you will listen His Excellency very carefully, and please note your questions, because after the speech we will have a question answer part. And let me now welcome His Excellency to give his speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, speaking to a new university. I teach at an old university in New York, Columbia, which I'm reminded every time I walk across the campus was founded in 1754. So we're a little bit older than you are, but you know, that will change eventually. The difference will be less. It's especially an opportunity, in my mind, to speak to a Turkish audience and to visit Turkey this week. When I worked in the U.S. government, I dealt with the former Soviet Union, and I found nothing more valuable than consulting with Turkish officials and scholars. I visited here, I would say, more than any other Allied capital for consultations. And I appreciate the opportunity to continue that dialogue at a time when, as the title of this talk suggests, we have a lot to think about in our relations with Russia, with other post-Soviet states. And it's clear not only that we have a lot to think about, but we have a need to think harder. For the first part of this week, I've been in Moscow, and I've come away with some impressions that I want to share with you in the course of my lecture. Now, the current atmosphere of Russian-American relations is very heated. There's a lot of talk about a new Cold War. People asking, how bad will this relationship get? This question was being asked seriously even before the war in Georgia. But now there's a new intensity to it. And people are wondering whether the aim that American and Western policy had toward Russia after the Cold War is now hopeless. The aim was to establish a close partnership, to work on problems of common interest, to establish close relations with the other states of the former Soviet Union. Is that over? I want to look at, in trying to answer that question, I want to do three things today. I want to talk about what I think is exaggerated in that discussion about whether there's a new Cold War. Second, I'd like to talk about what I think is not exaggerated. When I talk about what's exaggerated, I'll give the reasons to expect some continuity and continued cooperation. When I talk about what is exaggerated, I'll say what I think the problems are and where there are difficulties that we need to think harder about. And then I want to say a little bit about what the way forward might be. What kind of strategy could we think about for dealing with dealing with Russia in the future? And that's a problem that we can only successfully address if we're able, the U.S. and Turkey and other allies in Europe, if we can work on that together. Now, I said I thought that there are some exaggerations, some overly overstated, sometimes emotional, sometimes ideological, sometimes merely incorrect ideas about U.S.-Russian relations and the new Cold War. The picture that you sometimes hear is of an escalating confrontation. One side doing one thing, the other taking another response that intensifies the confrontation and adds to disagreements. I think this is not really true of either Russian or American policy making. I think, in fact, in both Russia and the United States, there are some serious conclusions that policymakers and senior officials are drawing about the confrontation that we've had. And in particular, I was struck when I was in Moscow this week by the number of second thoughts and reservations that I heard people express about Russian policy in Georgia. They do this cautiously now. They don't openly criticize what the Russian government did, but they mention many different mistakes that Russia made. This is not just from outside the government, but from people who are within it, who are thinking that perhaps the cost for Russia of what it did was too great. And they are thinking about themselves about how to restore a better relationship with the United States and other European countries. There are other reasons that I think this picture of escalating confrontation is probably wrong. One of the complaints that Russia has made about Western policy is that they're steadily enlarging the NATO alliance and that they're taking steps even in the next few months in this direction. I think there are many Western countries that are thinking about adjusting that policy. I think it's also true that some of the steps that were taken after the war to show displeasure and disapproval toward Russia will probably be reversed. In our country, some agreements with Russia were put aside that were in the waiting for approval by the Congress. They've been postponed, but they will probably be revived next year. I also think that you've seen a change in official rhetoric on both sides and in Europe since the immediate days after the Georgian War. You've seen some attempt to moderate the official rhetoric toward or about their disagreements, about Russian-American disagreements. Finally, I think it's not right to talk about a new Cold War because both Russia and the United States and its allies have so many other things to worry about these days. When we talked about the old Cold War, it was the central international reality for decades. It was the main problem that the United States and the Soviet Union thought about in their relations with the outside world. It was the main reality that European countries had to deal with. Maybe I don't need to say that in the middle of a global financial crisis, relations with Russia are not the #1 issue on the American foreign policy agenda. When people talk about a new Cold War, they might be talking about a new set of long-lasting disagreements between Russia and America, and I'll get to some of that. But they're not talking about a new central principle, a new basic dividing line in international relations. Or if they are, they're wrong. Now, that's what I think is exaggerated. That's the emotionalism of an immediate post-war situation where people suddenly see a new drama unfolding and they ask, where can this go? How bad can it get? And often the analyses go too far. However, I said I wanted to talk about what's not exaggerated, what is a real problem in Russian-American relations and in Russian relations with the West. And I would describe two things here. One is the Russian picture of American and Western goals. And the second is the American and Western picture of Russian goals. And I think here you see great uncertainty on both sides. I'll give you an example. The secretary of the Security Council in the Russian government, a man named Patrushev, a couple of weeks ago talked about what American goals are toward Russia. And he said the real aim of the United States is to gain military and strategic superiority over Russia and to find ways of weakening it. And one of the senior generals in the Russian General Staff said the real goal of America is strategic domination over Russia. I won't say whether this is true or not, but I think if you went to the Pentagon and asked people, how much time do you spend thinking about Russia? You know what they would say? A small number. A small round number. Nevertheless, there is this picture in Russia of which is, one reads it in the media, it's very common in public discourse, that the goal of the West is to weaken Russia and to gain military opportunities. This man, Mr. Patrushev, that I referred to, was talking about how the goal is to be able to put missiles and weapons close to Russia so as to hit industrial targets. I think there's an atmosphere of extraordinary national agitation in Russia. If you just ask Russians, what do they think the United States is doing? It's one very moderate commentator said recently, what's the goal of the West toward Russia? It's to kill us all off. Well, you know, that gives you an idea of the outlook. And while that's very emotional, underneath this, there is a view that the goals of the West are dangerous and extreme. I think you see, moreover, a kind of domestic constituency. How many of you here study political science in some way, or study politics? Well, you know that in analyzing foreign policy, you often look at the domestic groups that are interested in pursuing a particular foreign policy. And these days in Russia, you have some important domestic groups that actually like confrontation. They benefit from it. The military, for example, sees, because Russia is richer now, an opportunity to really increase their military budget. They don't want partnership. They like the idea of new tension, because that gives them an opportunity to modernize their forces. I'll give you an example. Our Secretary of Defense, the American Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, when he talks about Russian-American relations, it's always very calm. He says, one Cold War was enough. We don't want another one. Why is that? Secretary Gates does not want to spend more money thinking about Russia, preparing for any kind of competition with Russia. He's got a budget that he's devoting to other things. The Russian Defense Ministry, when they talk about the United States, they're not very calm. They have an interest in a very different kind of budget. Their budget has been low and they really want it to be high, and they want to focus on the United States. There are Russian nationalist politicians who also have an interest in confrontation, because they benefited from it. An atmosphere of nationalism is good for them. So I'll give you one example. One of the most prominent nationalist politicians in Russia is now ambassador to NATO. This is a man who's made his career saying nasty things about the United States. And he's the ambassador to NATO. He is an advocate of reducing cooperation with NATO. Now, one thing that you know in diplomacy is that the ambassador to anything is always in favor of good relations with that country or with that organization. That's his job. The American ambassador in Turkey, my good friend, Ambassador Wilson, his job is to promote good relations with Turkey. The Russian ambassador to NATO is not in favor of good relations with NATO. He's a nationalist politician who's benefited from bad relations. So you have groups that are not eager for an improved atmosphere. Now, I said there's another element of this picture of problems in Russian-American relations that's not exaggerated, and that is there are a lot of questions in the United States about what Russian goals are. The war in Georgia raised a lot of questions about what Russia's policy toward its neighbors is going to be. And I think the new administration that is elected in next month is going to have to give a higher priority to this question, to answering this question: what is American policy, what is Western policy toward what looks like a Russian policy to gain more power in relation to its neighbors. The president of Russia, Mr. Medvedev, you probably know, recently said that one of the principles of Russian policy is to have what he called privileged interests toward its neighbors, meaning not just ordinary relations, but special privileges. Well, people ask, what do you mean by special privileges? And in fact, 2 weeks ago, the Russian foreign minister came to my organization in New York, the Council on Foreign Relations, and I got up in the audience where Mr. Henderson is sitting, and I said, what did President Medvedev mean by special relations, privileged interests? What is it that you're looking for in relations with your country? he didn't answer this question. He found it very difficult to answer. And some Russian friends have said to me, the reason is he doesn't want to say, because the answer isn't very nice. So Americans have questions about where Russian policy is headed, and they have a greater awareness of the need to consult with allies about what the future relations with Russia might be like. And that's not an exaggeration either. That means Western countries tend to think they're in a new phase of relations with Russia, where they have to re-examine what the relationship has been like, and perhaps come up with new answers to what policy should be in the future. Now, I said that I would say a little bit about what the way forward might be in relations with Russia. If it's not a new Cold War, what will it be? Something else, perhaps. What will we call it? How will we come to this policy? I tell my students in New York that sometimes in a time of great uncertainty and challenge, people turn to old ideas. And I actually have recently been recalled the old ideas of one of my first bosses in the State Department, Secretary George Shultz, who, when he became Secretary of State in the 80s, about more than 25 years ago, he said that a policy toward the Soviet Union should be based on three things: realism, strength, and dialogue. And I want to say just a little bit about what I think each one of those might mean today, because I think Secretary Shultz is a very wise man, and he recently published an article with Henry Kissinger, which some of you could probably find on the web. I don't totally agree with it, but you'll find it an interesting discussion of what policy toward Russia should be. Let me just mention, though, what the three pieces of a policy based on realism, strength, and dialogue might be. First, realism. I think people are re-examining Russian power and purposes. And they want to they don't want to base it on wishful thinking. They want to take a hard look, not to exaggerate Russian capabilities or intentions, but not to ignore problems, not to wish them away. Maybe in the past we sometimes thought, we can have better relations with Russia next year if we just ignore some problems that we've had this year. I think there's less desire to do that now, and I think that realism will be a greater part of policy in the future. What about strength? What does that mean in relation to policy toward Russia? In the 2 months since the war in Georgia, there's been a lot of emphasis on doing things toward Russia that show disapproval, that punish Russia in a way. I think that probably won't be the main focus of policy in the future. The focus of policy in the future will be more on creating circumstances in which it's harder for Russia to make trouble. In the Cold War, this approach was called creating situations of strength. This is a classic formula which meant not that we have to have a confrontation with Russia, but that we have to create an environment in which Russia cannot make trouble for other countries. And I think you'll probably have something like that develop in the future. And I mentioned two areas where you might see that happening. One is supporting Russia's neighbors, giving them the opportunity to become part of Western institutions, helping Georgia, for example, to rebuild after the war. The United States has already set aside a large amount of money for this year and next year for economic reconstruction in Georgia. And I think there will be a continuing openness to the idea that states of the former Soviet Union that were Russia's neighbors should be able to be part of Western institutions. I think in Turkey, there's a particular understanding that there shouldn't be any countries disqualified because of geography or history or culture in being part of European institutions. And I think we can appreciate how that should work for other countries. Ukraine, for example, wants to be part of the European Union. Its government, although not all of its people, want to be part of NATO. That should be a dialogue over the next few years that we all support. Secondly, talking about creating circumstances where we can have greater confidence that Russia won't make trouble for Western countries. I think energy is one obvious issue where people have a kind of concern about Russia's, not only its own energy, use of its own energy resources, but the aim of creating a kind of dominant position over other energy producers or over energy transportation. I think that issue is going to be much more prominent than it used to be between the United States and the European Union, for example. It's clear that there's a need for a common energy policy. And if there's not a common energy policy, it will be much harder to get the kind of relationship that we want with Russia in the future. Let me mention the third part of George Shultz's strategy, which is dialogue. Because I think all of these measures that we've talked about, creating situations of strength, trying to create a positive environment on Russia's periphery, all of those will be read somewhat differently by Russia if we don't manage to improve and restabilize Russian-American relations. So I think you will see an enhancement of dialogue between Russia and the United States, between Russia and Europe, between Russia and NATO, between Russia and other Western countries individually in the coming years. You'll have a return on the part of the United States, certainly, I believe, of something that we've almost forgotten about. And that used to be called arms control. In a distant period of the past, the United States and the Soviet Union and the United States and Russia negotiated about controls, limits on their strategic arms arsenals. We sort of forgot about that. It's going to come back. You watch. We will probably pick up some ideas that the Russians have put forward for European security and probably a European security conference. Mr. Medvedev in particular has made such an idea perhaps his most distinctive foreign policy proposal. And I think my prediction is Western countries probably next year will look at those ideas that the Russians have put on the table and they'll say, well, we don't like that one and we don't like that one and maybe we could adjust that one, but basically they'll say yes. So there will be more dialogue to go along with the strength that George Shultz advocated. I think there will be all elements of this strategy. We can't forget about the domestic obstacles that I described earlier. Groups in the Russian establishment that aren't looking for an improvement of relations, that find that maybe not best for them. But I think we will see an evolution toward more dialogue as well. I don't think this policy has to be put in place immediately. In fact, I think it can't be put in place immediately because it has to be the result of a kind of consultation among allies first. For us in the United States, this process really will wait for a new administration. But all the countries of the Western Alliance really need to be addressing it because we need to have common answers. Our goal is not just to ease tension, but to move toward a different kind of relationship with Russia that is more productive for all of us. We've seen in the Georgian War how hard that can be, and we've seen in we've had other reasons to conclude that it's hard. But if we don't have a new approach over the next year between the United States and all of its allies, and I include Turkey here especially. I said I used to come to Turkey more than any other capital because of how much we had to talk about. I think if we don't have a new approach in the next year, we will have missed an important opportunity. Thank you very much. Now, how would you like to do questions? Would you like me to call on people who put their hands up?
No,
I'm experienced doing that.
Yeah.
I've done it in my own classes, and I also said earlier that I can call on people too. I sometimes do that in my own classes, and my students don't like that as much. But if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Well, let me ask you a question then. How do you see Russian relations with Turkey? Do you think that the United States and Turkey have a basic common approach toward dealing with Russia, or do you think there are differences? Who can answer that question? Since the chairman of the International Relations Department said we were going to have a conference here, we should have a dialogue, not just wait for questions from the audience, not just a press conference, but a discussion. All right. Well, I'm also happy to...
There are some hands.
Hands in the back? Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question.
Sure. Why don't you stand up so everybody can hear you?
This is Ahmet Nom from the Department of International Relationships. My question is, the beginning of the conference, you say Russia sees the tension as a way to a more modern military power.
Yeah.
And you think this is also some kind of an opportunity to say, here I am, and this is what I am capable of doing, or do they really take care of the minority in Georgia? This is my question. Thank you.
Well, I think they're both. Both of those motives are important. For some years, Russian leaders have been saying quite openly, something has changed in international relations. And that something is, we're back. You know what that means in English? We're back, right? Nodding heads. Yes, you understand? We're back, and as I used to summarize it, we're mad. For some Russian leaders, it's good to be back, you know? Russia, I mean, and it really is good for Russia in general. Russia's GNP is now many times greater than it was at the beginning after the Soviet Union collapsed. They've had, 7% growth in this decade each year. That's probably like Turkey. Disposable income has increased for ordinary households 10% every year. That means a new style of life for ordinary people. But Russian political leaders have wanted more than just prosperity. They want to find some way of showing that the international order gives Russia a larger place. But how to do that? And I find when I talk to some Russians that it seems as though the way to do that is to have a disagreement that they can win. You need to have a fight and come out ahead. And I think this is a kind of, you know, you can understand this psychologically. Politically, it can create some problems. The military in Russia, in particular, are an interesting institution that is very angry about what happened to them in the 90s. Their budget went down and down and down. Their equipment got old. They didn't have an opportunity to replace it, to modernize it. And they like the opportunity to show that they can actually conduct an effective military operation. So you're right. They were very glad to have the media showing Russian tanks moving forward without breaking down, which is what happened in the Chechen War often. They like the appearance of a very sophisticated modern military operation. Now, what's interesting in Russia is that that's what was on television. In the newspapers, there have been many descriptions of the difficulties that the Russian military had in Georgia. In fact, many things broke down. They discovered that they... how many of you have cell phones? No, how many? No, how many have cell phones? It's a larger number than that, I'm sure. Okay. The Russian military discovered when they got to Georgia that their maps, their GPS system, who's got a GPS phone? You know, one that works anywhere, can tell you where you're located? Their GPS system broke down. Suddenly they were trying to communicate with each other on cell phones. They had to get using Georgian cell phone service to communicate between Russian military units. This is not the way it was supposed to work. And they're angry with each other and talking about how this was a sign that this operation did not work well at all. And there are many other examples of things that did not work well. And the military are now using these to say, you see, we need an even bigger budget. Because if we have to do this again, we've got to have systems that work better. This article that was describing the cell phones and the maps, they wanted to use the computers and the satellites for the maps, and because they couldn't do that, in addition to using their cell phones, they had to pull out their old maps. According to the Russian newspapers, World War II maps. And this is, again, an example. This is not a modern military. They want to modernize. And Mr. Putin, after the war, announced that the Russian military budget would go up by 27% this year. That's a big number. And this year and next year together, 50%. Now, was there a kind of Russian interest in the South Ossetian minority? Yes. It was this is a, you know, an issue that has been part of kind of Russian imperial life and Soviet imperial life, relations among the minorities of the Caucasus for centuries. The Russians in the early 90s intervened as peacekeepers to try to keep the Georgians and the South Ossetians from fighting. But over time, they stopped being peacekeepers. And it became their presence of their forces there it was not just to keep the peace. It also became part of the clash between Russia and Georgia itself. So that it's a conflict that had its origins in ethnic disagreements. But it added many new dimensions. The desire of the military to act and to show not only that it could act, but that it needed even more modern equipment and training to do better. It took on a geopolitical dimension. Many Russians said, you know, we weren't just defeating the Georgians here, we were defeating the United States. And so they were very happy to have examples of equipment in Georgia that they captured that had been supplied by the United States, or you know they used some of these missiles that are for reconnaissance, drones that are supplied by Israel. They showed those on television. There have been you know, training and equipment provided by Turkey, also on television, because the Russians found that the part of the national enthusiasm of this war was that it wasn't just beating the Georgians, it was taking on NATO. And they liked that, because as I said, we're mad, we're back, and we're mad. And so the enthusiasm for the war had a larger dimension to it. It wasn't just about this ethnic issue. Who else has a question? Another hand, yeah.
First of all, I want to say thank you for coming.
Pleasure.
You were mentioning about the Pentagon peoples are not into in a how to say like in a race with the Russian people.
Yeah.
But
Well, with the Russian military.
Yeah,
Yeah.
military. Of course, the Russian military is not so powerful
Yeah.
to race with the Americans. Anyway, I want to ask that the American military or American politicians,
Yeah.
maybe they are not very intent to be in a race. But when we look at the map,
Yeah.
we can see everywhere the American. Even in Iraq, maybe in the future in Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and even in the Gürcistan.
Even in where?
In
Georgia.
Sorry.
Tell me how you say that in Turkish.
Gürcistan.
Say it again.
Gürcistan.
Do you know how the Georgians, what the Georgian name for Georgia is?
No.
Who knows that?
George.
Anybody?
George?
Georgia?
Yeah.
No, that's not the Georgian name for Georgia. That's interesting. People think that. Well, I don't have a blackboard here.
Do you know it?
Yes! But most people don't. And in fact, many people who are senior officials in the US government, I asked them, do you know what the Georgians call themselves? What their country is called? It's called Sakartvelo. Sakartvelo. Yeah. You can ask yourself why. Well, and I'm not a specialist on these things. I only happen to know this because I once asked a Georgian political leader, I asked a Georgian diplomat. Actually, it was the Speaker of the Georgian Parliament. I said, what is your country called here? Sakartvelo, it's Kart. The middle part of that, Sakartvelo, the Kart is that's their name for what they think their people, their ethnicity. At any rate, tell me again how it's said in Turkish?
Gürcistan.
Gürcistan, okay.
When we look at the map, we can see the really grand chessboard, and it's really difficult for us because we are planning our future now.
Yeah.
And when we look at our future, we just see it all around the wars. So it's really scaring us. I'm really scared to hear when I applied to a job, what is your plan in 5-year period? So I can say, if there is no war around, I'm planning to continue my academic career. So what do you think about American policy in Middle East? It will continue like this, or maybe after some failures like in Iraq, they will give up, I guess.
It's a good question, and it's definitely related to our topic about U.S.-Russian relations. Why is the United States not thinking about Russia in the Pentagon? You know, when you go to, you know, if you go to the Pentagon and you talk to a colonel who's a planner, and you say, how do you expect to become a general? You know, if you're going to get a promotion, what difficult problem are you going to work on that will show that you deserve to become a general? It's not Russia. Since 2001, the United States has been focused on dealing with, properly or improperly, successfully or unsuccessfully, a new threat that that the United States government has been trying to understand, successfully or unsuccessfully, correctly or not. We don't need to answer that, although I want to get to it. But that's this decade. In this decade, the American strategic focus was on something completely different. In the 90s, the American strategic focus was not so clear because the Cold War had ended. But it didn't, at that point, it seemed as though Russia was not a threat. So you already had a kind of decade of preparing not to focus on Russia, and then to focus on something else. So you now have, at more than a decade, almost 2 decades, of American military leaders who are planners, who are thinking about the problems that they have in the world apart from Russia. There's only one way in which they really think about Russia, and that's in relation to the strategic nuclear forces of both sides. You know, we still have these large nuclear forces that are left over from the Cold War, and the Russians still have some of them. They're all getting smaller. The reductions have been very big, and in conventional forces in Europe too. You know, in the Cold War, the United States had thousands of tanks in Europe. Do you know how many tanks there are in Europe the United States has now? I think it's about 100. And what can you do with 100 tanks? And I don't even know where they are, but it's nothing. You know, these levels, all the countries of Europe have basically, they spent the past 15 years just getting rid of their tanks. And the Russians too, the Ukrainians, the Poles, everybody. Because the Cold War is over. What do you do with these tanks? So there was that change of focus. Now, what you're describing in Iraq and Afghanistan are the 2 problems that, having worked on this since 2001, that the United States is left with. How to make those efforts finally more manageable, successful, stable, so that there can be a reduction in the American presence in Iraq. And the past 2 years have been quite successful from that point of view. The fighting is down, the level of casualties is down, the American force levels are now a little bit down, and will probably, I would say no matter who is elected, probably go down after that. So if you're asking about that, you know, and I know there's a direct Turkish concern here, which is very understandable. I would say the prospect for a you know, continuing war there are less. In Afghanistan, there's a you know, one can't be so confident because although that military effort went very well at first, it's now, of course, less successful. And the entire NATO alliance is wrestling with this problem. It's probably the single biggest problem that the NATO alliance faces now. And over the next 5 years, you will probably see a somewhat greater effort there, but maybe not so much simply a greater effort, but a change in strategy, an attempt to gain some of the success that we saw in Iraq, in Afghanistan, to have in a way, a less militarized strategy that's directed more at trying to create popular support for the government. Iran is a problem that the United States and many European allies are worried about, and many Middle Eastern countries are worried about, because they think about what the world will look like if Iran has nuclear weapons. And so there's a major diplomatic effort to try to control that problem that the Russians participate in. But I think in a broad way, you're right about one thing, and that is that the security focus for the United States, which 20 years ago was on the Cold War, has now shifted to a broad set of issues in the, call it the greater Middle East. It sort of extends to Central Asia, to South Asia. And the strategy, I mean, you see this in our presidential debates. When people ask Barack Obama about where he sees really big dangers, do you know what country he talks about? He's worried a lot about Pakistan. The border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, he is, focused on as a great source of insecurity, not just for the United States, but for all countries that could be the target of terrorism. I think over the past couple of years, the United States and Turkey have cooperated better and have reached more agreement about dealing with terrorism in and around Turkey. So I think you see that as part of the agenda. I think it would be a tragedy if, at this point, 20 years after the Cold War, we had to start thinking about Russia as a security problem again. And I think it shouldn't happen, and probably won't happen, but it's a kind of concern now that is greater than it was 10 years ago and 20 years ago, because of the uncertainties about where Russian policy is headed. So I would say if you're looking 5 years out, the list of countries that you need to think about where the issue is, will there be more war or less war? I think you could be more confident about Iraq, uncertain about Afghanistan. If you were worried about Iran, you would not be the only one. And if you were thinking about Pakistan, you would have President Obama thinking with you. So it's if you look at where those problems are centered, they're not in Europe anymore. And if we can deal with those problems on the basis of unity among a lot of countries that have a long history of working together, that is the United States and its allies in NATO, and countries that have not always worked together, like the United States and Russia, we'll have a much better chance of succeeding. Yeah?
Yes. My name is Karen Uchihara of International Relations Department.
You're not a student, I can tell.
Well, I'm not a specialist on U.S.-Russian relations.
Yeah.
But simply because I'm interested in the crisis in Georgia, which is a part of my field of specialization, which is conflict and conflict resolution.
Yeah.
There was an issue you raised to the students, or to the audience, whether they think the U.S. approach and the U.S. and the Turkish approach, are there differences with respect to Georgia's conflict?
Yeah.
Well, what I should say is this: historically, Turkey has been an ally with the U.S. and they have been working together.
Yeah.
especially as you already mentioned on terrorism.
Yeah.
But the justification of this depends on the citizens, not me.
Yeah.
But I think the relationship between Georgia, between United States and Turkey developed more in the 1990s. That is, after the split or the downfall of the Soviet Union. Why? Because when we think about Kosovo, Georgia, and others, I think Turkey has got some affiliations with these present new created states. And we can see this, that Turkey has been a very good player. It has been playing a very strong role in terms of peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, and so on and so forth. I think this is the much I can say.
I think you're right, definitely right about expanded cooperation in the 90s. And it has a number of dimensions, and you mentioned some important ones. I think it's too bad we couldn't expand that cooperation even more than we did. For example, I remember in the 90s people sometimes talking about whether it would be possible to replace the Russian forces in South Ossetia and Abkhazia with international forces that might have, for example, have included other countries from the region, like Turkey, like Ukraine, other countries with a long-standing interest in peacekeeping, Finland, Sweden, Austria, others from a little bit outside the region, Egypt, Pakistan, India. The Indians actually tended to have a number of participants in the UN observation force in Georgia, but we never managed to get a truly international peacekeeping force. And that was a failure. That was an area where we could have done more. But I'll give you other examples where the United States and Turkey cooperated in a kind of informal way. For example, in the 90s, NATO set up what was called the Partnership for Peace, which was to build relations between the military establishments of Western countries and the rising military establishments of the countries of the former Soviet Union, like Russia or like Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, under the Partnership for Peace, could send military officers for training to the United States. But do you know what country trained 10 times as many Kazakh military officers as the United States? Turkey. Because you had a greater capacity for it, you had a close relationship with Kazakhstan, and including cultural and even somewhat linguistic. So, in the 90s, there were opportunities that we never dreamed of that became possible. Wasn't really restricted just to security. I remember in my time in the State Department in the 90s, I also worked there in the 80s. In the 90s, we spent a lot of time working with Turkey on energy issues. The pipeline that now brings oil from Baku, that goes through Georgia to Tbilisi, that then comes to Ceyhan, was built as an example, as a result of cooperation above all between two countries, the United States and Turkey. And the gas pipeline that was built in parallel was a response to Turkey's awareness of its need for gas in the coming decades, that it didn't want to satisfy entirely by getting gas from Russia. So that was a very, very successful example of cooperation. And there are others that that I could keep listing. I think in this period, Turkey began with much more knowledge of this region than we did. We both, though, learned a lot about how these countries were going to be developing. We learned that sometimes our expectations were not correct. We learned that there were problems that developed that we would have to deal with. We saw problems that needed attention that we sometimes failed to deal with successfully. When, again, in the 90s, we spent a lot of time trying to resolve the dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. And Turkey played an important part in that. But it didn't succeed. There may be an opportunity to come back to that one. It'll be very, very difficult. But in all of these cases, cooperation between the U.S. and Turkey has been an immense asset that has served American interests and I think Turkish interests as well. I saw another hand up here before we recognized that that question, and I don't want to let it go away. I don't remember where it was, though. Yeah.
Department of International Relations.
I'm sorry. You're from the
Department of International Relations.
I see.
I have a small question because I think you are tired.
No, no. I'm only warming up.
My question is, you have talked about the economic reconstruction and so-called social reconstruction of Georgia.
Yeah.
And you said that America must have common policy with European Union and Turkey. Do you think that these policies can be successful without interruption of Russia? Because we can all guess that this would take a lot of time to reconstruct a country, or we can say Georgia. Thank you.
Well, it's a good question. I think some of the immediate needs, were humanitarian, and I think those have been pretty successfully dealt with, although there is a large number of refugees still, and they are the question of how to deal with that refugee population is going to be a tough one. I think the Georgian government is probably looking at a level of refugees that might even be 100,000, and in a small country that's a lot of people. And there's always the question of, do you accept the idea that these are permanent refugees, or are you hoping that they'll be able to go back to their homes? Now, the United States is, is looking at, the Congress, I think, has proposed something in the order of $500 to $600 million for next year in assistance. That's a lot of money. And in fact, it'll probably be a big challenge to support it. A lot of it is export credits. That's the way we often give assistance, which is sometimes not so easy to use because it takes, you have to organize business deals and purchases. The European Union has, I believe, allocated something like about 200 million, and that's a lot of money too. Not as sure of that number, and it's in any case euros. Can that effort succeed without Russian cooperation? Definitely. Can Russia make it harder for the Georgian reconstruction to succeed? Definitely. Russia provides a lot of Georgia's gas, and one question is, are they going to continue to supply gas this winter? And on what basis? At what price? With what kind of interruptions? When things happen that they don't approve of. The Georgians are very nervous about this. they have been able to rely in the past several years, when they've had cutoffs from Russia on gas from Azerbaijan and Turkey. And I would predict they will be relying to some extent on Turkish and Azeri gas this winter. The Russians, for the past several years, have had a kind of economic embargo against against Georgia. And one question will be, are they going to relax that and allow more trade or not? The Georgians have adapted pretty successfully to that embargo, but it would certainly help Georgia if that embargo were lifted. There's been a partial lifting, and I think the Russians have an interest in lifting it further for one important reason. Does anybody know what it is that Russia wants from Georgia that is related to economic goals? Everybody knows a lot about what Georgia wants from Russia. Russia wants Georgia to remove its objections to Russia's entry into the World Trade Organization. Because the Georgians have understandably said, if you have an embargo against us, you are not a good citizen of the World Trade Organization. And the Russians want to be in this. So that will be one issue that might provide a kind of reason for the Russians to be a little more cooperative. But I wouldn't promise it. I wouldn't count on it. If we have more questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much for this very interesting speech. Please accept this plaque for the remembrance of today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.